session?
No, this is our eighth session.
Eighth session. Okay, I
Yes.
don't keep count very well.
It's on the description of the claims.
Oh, okay. And we're meeting this month to kind of separate from our usual approach of looking at Marxism philosophically and in terms of its practical history, and we're reorienting onto Black History Month, specifically the party's work in civil rights activism. So the way that I set this up is lecture format, but I do have questions that I want us to kind of like think about and kind of work through assessing the significance here, because a lot has changed in how people, both just in the broad general public and in how academia views the civil rights movement. And these changes have come only within the last decade or so. So most American students are exposed at some point in their mid-level academic lives, that is, somewhere through K through 12, to the significance and impact of the civil rights movement, usually defined as, quote, a social effort to counter the repression and oppression of the Jim Crow laws that began after the death of Emmett Till in mid-1955. Anybody not know who Emmett Till is? No? Okay. So American students are taught to understand why so many people dedicated themselves to overturning the norms and customs that were established by Plessy versus Ferguson, otherwise known as the court decision after the Civil War that dictated the famous phrase, separate but equal. Students are usually also taught to understand how civil rights as a movement began in the courts with landmark cases, such as Henderson versus the United States in 1950, where it was deemed unlawful to subject someone to Jim Crow laws on railroads just because the train was going through a state that had the Jim Crow laws. Then there was Brown v. Board of Education, which I'm sure is kind of the biggest landmark case of the 1950s, in which segregation of schools is deemed unconstitutional at the federal level. And then Browder versus Gale in 1956, which begins the bus boycott success, because it's at that point in 1956 that the bus segregational system is deemed unconstitutional. And it's usually emphasized that the social movement, that is the grassroots campaign to support a civil rights bill or law, it's usually emphasized that that movement came as a result of such legislation. That, in other words, once the Brown v. Board decision was made, once the Henderson v. U.S. decision was made, and then the Browder v. Gale decision, then a grassroots movement could spawn up and start to take this fight out into the streets. I can already see Michelle shaking her head here. What's wrong with that?
The laws were changed due to grassroots movement, because they weren't all that anxious to change, but felt the pressure from below. And it was mighty pressure.
Yeah.
There was a lot of it.
Yes.
Jim?
Well, that's partially correct. But my recollection is, and I remember big discussions in the party, in the middle of the McCarthy period, how'd you get Brown versus Board of Education? And the conclusion was that there was international pressure on the United States, because the United States, like now, is around the world telling everybody we can have democracy. So countries were saying, yeah, but what about this and what about that, especially regarding Black Americans.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example of that, of international pressure that I had experience in. I was in the military, and this guy, this was in the 50s, he was, had been served in Korea as a switchboard operator. I guess everybody knows what that means.
Yeah.
You know, okay. That's kind of old stuff. But, and so he's sitting there, and General, I can't remember his name, the head of the 8th Army who took McCarthy's place, the guy who used to wear the grenades on his lapel, and he was head of the UN, United States and UN forces. Anyway, he was not important his name, but he's standing there, and this Turkish general, now Turkey was one of the main supporters of the Korean War, and Turkish general turns to him and says to him, why do you treat the Negro soldiers the way you do? And this guy told me the story, and they went in the office. So that's international pressure. That's an example of the kind of pressure they must have got. I'm not disagreeing with you, but It was more
Yeah,
international than local, I'm sorry.
Yeah, in terms of like the success of the legislation that was passed at the federal level, international pressure certainly did factor in. What I'm trying to highlight here is that if you go and open up a high school history textbook that covers the civil rights movement and it was published before 2010,
Yeah.
it pretty much sets it up like this. Here are these landmark cases that happened, and then here's this grassroots movement that resulted from it.
Oh, no, no.
They usually depict the
Yeah, sure,
grassroots movement as kind of a response to the success of the legislation, which then, where does that place agency? Who's actually, according to these history books, who's the agent of change in this? Is it the grassroots movement, or is it the courts and the state?
Right.
It's the courts and the state. That is at least what the narrative depicts. I like the Wayne State University. So, a lesser known story that is justly getting more attention by academia today is how this social movement did not precede legal legislation such as Brown v. Board, but rather how it preceded it. Part of the reason why this story did not gain attention until the 1990s and 2000s was because of what I called in my master's thesis the elephant in the room. Most of those who were most passionate about advocating civil rights during the 1930s and pre-1950s period were persecuted by anti-communist red baiting. Or they were persecuted via unconstitutional arrests under the Smith Act, as well as quasi-fascist loyalty oaths. As we have covered in our previous class sessions, or in one of our previous class sessions, the execution of the Rosenbergs was arguably the peak of this kind of political repression, and it was a signal to anyone and everyone that regardless of how innocent you may be, if you could be associated with subversion and pro-Soviet sympathies, you could be arrested as a traitor to the nation and subject to the penalty of death for treason. It is important to note that treason is the only crime listed in the Constitution as punishable by death. The Constitution does not list out punishments for crimes except treason, and it's canon to be death. New historical evidence ranging from oral history, such as what I've collected from Michelle, as well as oral histories collected by others, autobiographies that have newly become available, including Beatrice Lumpkin's autobiography, which was only published in 2015. And it's only starting to get traction in terms of people understanding it. This new history tells us that the civil rights movement, as we know it and understand it from our teachings in high school, actually began in the years of the Great Depression, and that the so-called landmark civil rights cases of the 50s and early 60s were actually the result of a grassroots effort which began by challenging Jim Crow in the voting booths, challenging it in the courts, and physically resisting efforts to race bait and segregate workforces and unions. To go over this history, it's obvious there's a lot to try and cover, but I decided to focus on three individuals that I think break up the significance of pre-1950s organizing. Those individuals are James Ford, Hosea Hudson, and Benjamin Davis. I kind of did this chronologically, and I'll throw out some questions in the middle. So to start with, James Ford. Who here has heard of James Ford before? Most of us? Okay. James Ford became a prominent name in the socialist circuit when he agreed to represent the so-called Negro delegation that was requested by the Fourth Profintern Congress in 1928. This was a preliminary conference that was set up to invite communist parties from around the world to begin to participate in the Communist International's third session, which began in July of 1928. The idea here was to just bring people up early on in about January of 1928 and to see what the delegates would be offering in the summer, what sentiments people had, where they saw the direction of their parties going in their home countries. Ford and the delegation were attending the Congress, at least in Ford's words, for the purpose of, quote, raising awareness about how segregation prevented union organizing in a rather unique way, likely unknown in the less racially divided areas such as Britain and Russia. So even though Europe is racially divided in many ways, Ford's point was to say, but the racial divisions in the United States are an exception. They are not the same kind of ethnic, religious-based tension that is in Europe. It is a more vehemently color-defined segregation and separation. Ford shocked the leaders of the CPUSA, who agreed to take him out there, when he directly attacked the party for its, quote, little success in the organization of black workers with organizing African Americans in general. In front of the Congress, the Soviet Congress, Ford stated that he felt the CPUSA and the leadership of the party missed the point of organizing African Americans as a precedent to organizing all workers, because in the United States, the division is so predominant that you can't just avoid one ethnic group of workers like you could do in some European countries. Ford believed that the party was guilty of, quote, also relegating African American members to insignificant positions in the party, and thus turning away a lot of younger members or potential members. In some cases, Ford felt that the CPUSA was actively driving black Americans away with its stances, and thus something had to be changed. With these criticisms, the pro-Finturn Congress agreed to have Ford come back in the summer and present his thesis to the entire Communist International, which he did on June 1st. So yeah, I'm sorry, it wasn't July, it was June. Overstepping the CPUSA, particularly William Foster and Benjamin Gitlow, who tried to tell him to curb his language, the Communist International unanimously supported Ford's request and ordered CPUSA leaders to, quote, step up efforts in creating revolutionary unions for African Americans and to help the existing unions organize non-segregated nuclei. In other words, go and set up a shop committee and purposefully make it integrative. Do not create a segregated workplace. Upon these orders, the CPUSA sent a delegate, John Pepper, back to the United States before the entire Congress was over, to push this new party line in organizing against Jim Crow, and specifically against racism. This is the first time that the party actually makes a decision using the word racism. Pepper brought back a document that was titled Policies on Negro Work, which, quote, underlined that the Negro question is a race question and stressed that communists should be, quote, the champions and organizers of the black working class. Almost overnight, the CPUSA jumped headfirst into the fight against racism and began producing articles and posters to depict it, usually through the Daily Worker, especially if you go to Marxist.org, they only have the Daily Worker hosted up to like 1933, 1932, but we're talking 1929, 1930 here. You can go and look up the issues of the Daily Worker from those years. Over 50% of the articles are all focusing on combating Jim Crow, finding ways to end segregation in workplaces. So it almost becomes the new party line for a significant chunk of time. While the party did not succeed at effectively combating racism in any legal or real way until about mid-1930, this new stance did have an almost immediate effect on how young African Americans viewed the party. Ford's presentation at the Congress also caused a slight rift in the party's leadership, as William Foster and James Cannon teamed up to condemn Jay Lovestone and his factional supporters for the blame of why we don't succeed with African American organizing, and it's part of the rift of the like Trotskyist split that occurs in the party. The Communist International concluded that regardless of who made the mistake lay with a concept called white chauvinism. Anybody know? And the general unwillingness of many organizers to work with African Americans because of their own embedded racial prejudice. And it's this concept of white chauvinism that really began to impact the way organizers started to work with non-party members. And to be clear, sometimes people, if you look up white chauvinism on the internet, it says that it's like a Marxist term, that it was used predominantly by communist circles, etc. From my experience in history, white chauvinism is not exclusively a communist idea. I can't come up with, I could not find where the root of the word came from, but it does show up frequently. White chauvinism?
Chauvinism, it's a person's name.
I understand the word chauvinism. I'm referring to white chauvinism, the specifics of it. But it was most certainly perpetuated by communists as a way to explain why people refuse to acknowledge racial injustice. An example of what the Comintern was criticizing would be someone who claims to support civil rights and an end to Jim Crow in the 1960s, but nevertheless chooses to move to a new neighborhood when African Americans start moving in because of some kind of fear of what this new demographic might do to the surrounding neighborhood. Between 1928 and 1930, this concept was what the Comintern believed was upholding racial divisions in the United States. White Americans either consciously support Jim Crow because they do not try and hide their hatred of African Americans,
Right.
or they passively accept it and make very little effort to change the situation. Next, the Comintern made a declaration that has since become infamous, at least in terms of communist philosophy. They claimed that because of Ford's presentation, African Americans in the United States represented a, quote, dispossessed nation, a, quote, nation of workers who lack a sovereign state. If you're unfamiliar with this concept, it is a similar argument to ethnic nationalism with regard to European Jews after World War II. The significance of Israel in 1947 is argued to rest on the notion that European Jews are persecuted because they are nationals who lack a sovereign state. Hence, we need to give them a sovereign state. You might also be familiar with this thesis if you read the works of Malcolm X, who revived it in the 1960s when he said things like, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us." That's taking the notion that we are a dispossessed people. We lack a nation. Ford, however, who was kind of the one who started this whole discussion in the 1928 Congress, challenged the Communist International on this issue. Because essentially what the Comintern was saying is that all African Americans want is independence. They want their own country. Ford he understood where they were coming from, but he was quick to be like, I don't necessarily know that that is exactly what African Americans want. He suggested that while African Americans are the product of a ruthless slave system that had since been abolished, this did not necessarily mean that they lacked a home, nor did it necessarily mean that they required their own nation. On this effort, Ford's calls fell on deaf ears. The Comintern and the leaders of the CPUSA instead began making calls for a, quote, Negro Soviet Republic that was made up of a large portion of the Black Belt states. The promotion of this policy became known as, does anybody know?
A nation within a nation.
Yes, but the formal policy of it was called National Self-Determination of the Black Belt.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So Ford conceded that African Americans do have the right to secession from the United States in the same sense that the colonists had the right to declare independence. But Ford cautioned to go much further than that. He explained there is a difference between having a right and needing it. Ford felt that African Americans on the whole do not need secession because they already identify with the United States as a home. And we see that in the existence of organizations like the NAACP and numerous other pro-black organizing groups throughout the 1910s and 1920s. It suggests that these people aren't necessarily looking for a way out, they're looking for a way to further integrate into society. As a result of factional infighting and an inability to get Ford's delegation to the Comintern to agree to this concept of national self-determination, the issue remained unresolved after the Sixth Congress and became colloquially known throughout party circles as the Negro problem. It nevertheless is important to point out how Ford's delegation had a level of sway and persuasion with the Soviet-run Communist International that most are completely unaware of. If you go and read the history books of the Communist International, the most famous one being The Secret World of Soviet Communism, they talk about the Communist International as this monolith who pushes a button and everyone follows. Like, there's no question, nobody can sway the decision-making power of the Communist International. Ford's delegation in 1928, even if he couldn't convince them to abandon this national self-determination concept, he did make it clear that racism in the United States requires a different approach than what communist groups are doing in Europe. It requires a fundamentally practical approach that thinks about the unique nature of racial divisions in this country versus other countries. That's something that a lot of historians missed, and that's what I tried to point out very heavily in my dissertation as one of the most significant things that Ford did in his lifetime, is he pretty much proved that a single African-American communist can go to the Soviet-run Communist International and basically tell them, look, you guys don't understand this as well as you think you do. And they will listen and respond to that. most anti-communist historians will tell you there's no way that's true. Like, there's no way that the Communist International would listen to a black American. There's no way. Well,
Right.
it is true.
There's a lot of people still feel that way.
Yeah, well, that's not what happened in the summer of 1928. Ford's delegation directly challenged his own party's stances by combating racism and deemed the party's efforts ineffective. And while he may not have convinced the Communist International that African Americans do not desire secession, he did convince them that the CPUSA was not doing enough and thus forced the leadership of the party to respond. Ford's work became so successful in organizing drives that he quickly saw his popularity in the party soar by 1930. The party's stances on ending Jim Crow and organizing black citizens as a prerequisite for engaging in community activism was also successful. Between 1929 and 1930, about 450 African Americans registered with the party, and they had a turnover rate of about 50% after 1 year. So 450 came in, 225 would leave within a year. Between 1930 and 32, however, over 3,000 African Americans registered with the party and had a turnover rate of less than 25%. So the significance is that you have the 28 to 29 period in which the party's trying to figure out what to do with this Negro problem, as it's called. But then once they decide to just fully fledge their support for ending Jim Crow and using the word racism and saying we are combating racism. I'm sure some of you guys have seen the posters from 32 where it says racism chains both. Like, those posters are some of the first instances where Americans are exposed to the word racism as a negative, pejorative thing. In 1932, African Americans made up about 9.4% of the party membership. By the end of World War II, this had grown to 14%. So it was successful. The party's change in stances was successful in organizing black Americans. In 1932, Ford ran for vice president on the CPUSA's ticket behind William Foster. Up to that point, Ford was the second African American in history to be nominated to the vice presidency and the first of the post-Civil War generation. In their campaign, Foster and Ford ran posters that likely shocked a lot of Americans who were not used to seeing calls of ending Jim Crow, and that includes the racism chains both, which attempts to directly link the concept of racism to the chains that bind workers from Marx's literature. Together, in 1932, the two polled 103,307 votes. While this was smaller than 1% of the voting total in that year, this was a significant improvement from just 4 years before, where Foster and Benjamin Gitlow netted only 48,550 votes. So more than double the amount of votes after changing the party stances in 1928. With regard to running a national election amidst a capitalist crisis, the Great Depression, Ford had this to say, quote, "We, communists, have no illusions about running in this election. We have no illusions about the fact that this government will never allow the rise of a communist party into a position of power. This is not why we run our campaign. We run our campaign to show the masses not only what we stand for, but how the powers that be respond when we show what we stand for. We are the party of unity and an end to Jim Crow." In short, Ford makes it clear that even he believed the electoral system is not going to be favorable upon the Communist Party, but it does have a vital purpose in raising awareness. So Ford starts with this emphasis on we're not doing enough to raise awareness. The party changes its stances on racism and organizing African Americans, immediately starts to see success, and then Ford argues we need to expand this effort into the electoral system. We need to include these messages in our campaign to further broaden not just attraction to us, but attraction to the concept of fighting racism. Does that make sense? When it came to organizing citizens against segregation, Ford believed it was a movement that had to originate from the grassroots and could not be pushed upon a populace or a geographic area. It had to be somewhat spontaneous. And thus you needed something like an electoral campaign to get people to go like, oh yeah, that is a good idea. Maybe we should go down with Jim Crow. No one set it up to this point, but maybe we should consider that idea. So my question to you guys is, do you feel that James Ford and his work here was, I don't wanna ask the question, do you think it's significant, because I feel like it's a redundant question, but do you feel it is significant in how the party engaged with African Americans and their struggle for civil rights? Or do you think it's more circumstantial? That it's more the fact that James Ford is an African American who knows what African Americans might need better than the white leaders of the party in 1928.
Well, that's obvious.
Why do you say that's obvious? Because to
That
some
he-
people it wouldn't be.
He knew, he did know better. But, you know, white chauvinism now is called white privilege, right?
It's not really the same thing, but I see what you
It's
mean.
similar, so like, I don't think that I'm a racist, but I can't totally identify with my black friends because we have a different frame of mind. We've been raised differently.
Different life experience.
Yeah, totally different. I mean, my parents made sure that I met black people as I was growing up. But, and they worked very hard to make sure that my sister and I were not racist. But I think anybody who is white is almost always got some racism in it.
And that, I think, is kind of the idea behind white chauvinism, yeah, is there's this always like
Ingrained
embedded,
cultural,
yeah, it's
yeah.
an ingrained
I
thing.
mean, it's kind of unavoidable. We're a settler colonial country that has, you know, a captive population of African slaves that we brought here. I mean, you're going to have those kind of systems of oppression kind of become part of the
Right.
culture.
Mhm.
But families like mine and Michelle's are different than your average white families, where they feel superior. The whole society has encouraged them to feel superior.
Were you gonna say something, Michelle?
Oh, I was gonna ask you to restate your question because I got lost in it.
Okay, so,
But I think both parts of your question are valid.
oh yeah, so my question is, what is the real lesson to be learned from seeing Ford stand up to not only the Communist International, but also to the party leadership, Gitlow and Foster, to kind of be like, hey, you guys have a little bit of white privilege yourselves, and you
Right.
guys don't realize what the African Americans really need. And he even says this to the Soviet Comintern. So were you gonna say something more?
Well, to me, the significance of that episode is that it didn't tear apart the party, although there was a chance it could have.
You could have, yeah.
And you know that you said Foster was initially resistant to hearing this,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's really important. It's a really important lesson for us today in how we deal with division within our party. That we should be able to listen to each other
Yeah.
and be civil and not tear apart our party.
I agree. I certainly think that is probably a very important lesson, unrelated to, you know, civil rights activism and everything, is that, yeah, that is a moment at which I think if you look at William Foster's testimony on it, the reason why he tells Ford to like not try and present this has nothing to do with because Foster disagrees with Ford. It's because he's like, we don't want to look bad in front of the Soviets. We don't
Yeah.
want to have that kind of rap. But Ford is like, well, I'm going to push the issue anyway. But he did do it in a manner that, you're right, did not sow permanent division.
But what confidence Ford
Right.
must have had
Yeah.
in those who profess Marxist, you know, ideology, that they would listen to him, both in the American Communist Party and in the international scene, that he could do that.
And
That
that
was
it had,
that was an okay thing for him to do, it was the right thing, but that it would be listened to
Right.
even if not agreed to,
Because it was time.
because that is not normal society.
yeah, and the Sixth Congress had more than 50 communist parties from around the world in it. We're talking a Congress that had well over 900 members in attendance.
But-
And you needed to have translators, everything was being translated into various languages, so the confidence and the boldness of
Yeah.
Ford in that sense is
Yeah.
pretty strong.
I think my biggest takeaway from that is the importance of really getting feedback from the masses. Like, we as, you know, me personally as a cis white male here in America, I can't really be the one to speak on issues for the LGBTQ community or indigenous peoples
Right.
or people of color, like,
Or women.
or women, yeah, exactly. I think it's this kind of highlights why it's so important to actually seek out those voices to speak on those issues rather than assuming we understand them. You know, as Marxists, we can say, oh, well, we have this dialectical understanding of history and we can speak on their behalf, but we really can't.
Right.
And I think that's like the big takeaway for me, is that we need to be listening to those voices and to the masses.
There's another aspect to white privilege that I think most people are guilty of. They automatically underestimate the capabilities of people who are not like them. You know, Ford obviously he had a lot of experience talking to groups, and he probably had a lot of education, and he knew that he could convince people. So, and they didn't know that. Foster obviously didn't know that.
Yeah, I don't even think Foster really knew much about who Ford was before 1928, before he got offered to be this representative of the Negro delegation. I'm sure that would, like, upon meeting with, going over what that delegation is going to talk about at the Congress, was probably the first time Foster had ever actually sat down and had a conversation with him. Because there's very few records of Ford's work in the national circuit of the party prior to 1928. He joined in 26, I believe, but
What was his background?
I believe he was from Illinois. I think he was from Illinois. And his father was a mill worker, I think. I'm not 100% sure on that. That again is that is part of my own kind of, as I'm going to get to down at the bottom, my own white chauvinism is, you know, we don't know enough about these people because when we're researching them, sometimes we just don't dig far enough.
Sometimes you have to do a lot of digging to find the information.
You do, but
you have to know to dig.
You have to know to dig, yeah. All right, so I wanna move on so we don't run out of time here. The next person I want to talk about is Hosea Hudson. Among the individuals who were raptured by Ford's changing of the party program and its post-1928 stances on racism was Hosea Hudson, a young man from Georgia. He was born in Wilkes County and grew up a sharecropper. At the age of 16, he moved to Birmingham and got a job as a steel mill worker and became exposed to a variety of different organizations in that city that were all active in trying to combat segregation.
Birmingham what?
Alabama. Sorry. Not Massachusetts.
Michigan.
Is there a Birmingham, Michigan?
Yeah.
Oh, I never knew that.
Right next door.
And they used to have covenants in their city charter,
Oh, really?
keeping out blacks and Jews,
So
just like Grosse Pointe.
the first organization that he came across was one of the oldest organizations in Birmingham trying to combat segregation, which, can anybody guess what that was?
Say it again.
The oldest organization up to that point that was organizing against Jim Crow and segregation.
NAACP.
Yeah.
Exactly, the NAACP, who had formal offices in the downtown area and regularly hosted dinners and balls and large gatherings at their offices. There were numerous other labor leagues and civic justice leagues throughout Birmingham, much like the NAACP, but newer and younger, that hosted very formalized gatherings and held formal proceedings where only members could vote and speak and stuff like that. They did that thing where they would have like a conch shell that they would pass around and only the person who had it could speak. The last group that he found was the CPUSA and the YCL, who had a series of informal offices throughout Birmingham, much like kind of we have. Like sometimes we meet here, sometimes we meet at Swords and Plowshares, sometimes we meet all over the place. When Hudson was, and this is the real important part here, when Hudson was asked by historian Nell Painter why did he end up joining the CPUSA instead of the NAACP and the other organizations, he said this, and I'm quoting directly out of his autobiography. Well, you see, the NAACP had, and still has, a look about them. Ever since the early 1920s, they have had a focus on trying to produce respectable, mature, educated black men. Part of this involved their formalities, their highly formal meetings, and their dress codes. It was precisely this, however, that turned most black folk away from them. The NAACP, for all its formalities and string of history, was an all-around unattractive organization if you're a black steel worker or a black field worker. Such an organization looks at face value as something you don't belong in. Now, the CPUSA, they were, now, he didn't say CPUSA. People all back then were just calling it the Communist Party, but I want to clarify because there were varying groups. The CPUSA, they were fundamentally different. Their organizers were people I knew and worked with. Their leaders were in charge of local unions and headed negotiation boards. Most importantly, they did not require a dress code. They did not require a certain level of education. In fact, they would provide free classes for you. Their depiction in the newspapers as red agitators was parallel to the treatment faced by the abolitionists, the Jewish salesmen, and the Northerners throughout the South. What do you guys think he meant by all that? Why was the CPUSA attracted to him?
They're ordinary people, they were people
He's
like
a
him.
worker.
They were workers.
There were workers. So what about, so I don't know if you guys are aware, but if you were to look at like the photographs of the NAACP
Oh, yeah.
hosting meetings in the 1920s, what do you see?
Suits and ties.
Yeah, all suits and ties. So coming from his perspective, you're a steel worker. You just got off the steel line. You're wearing your overalls. Are you even ready to go to an NAACP meeting
Right.
after work? Like, no. But the Communist Party is going to be like, yeah, we're meeting at the bar down the street. Like, like they're totally different. And I think that, so what we see here is how Ford changed the stances of the party and then how that plays out into attracting a specific individual. Why does that change in policy happen? Hudson admitted that when he joined the party, he had not read a single work from Marx or Lenin and knew next to nothing about Marx's philosophy. It was exclusively the party's stances on racism and social injustice, as well as the way the newspapers depicted communists, that attracted him into the party.
Underdogs.
Well, not as underdogs. He said, right here, he goes, the depiction of the communists in the newspapers as red agitators is parallel to the treatment faced by abolitionists, Jewish salesmen, and Northerners throughout the South. Basically saying what the communists are doing is the same thing people like John Brown and the abolitionists were doing back in the pre-Civil War period.
Should have worn our John Brown shirt today.
That would have been very
Yeah.
topical. So Hudson became interested further into the Communist Party after meeting a man named Al Murphy, an organizer in the Birmingham district and neighbor of the local party leader named Frank Williams. Murphy, who was also an African American, joined in the summer of 1930 after hearing a white party leader hold a public meeting denouncing Jim Crow, a rather risky thing for anyone to do in the South, regardless of your color. And this is in Alabama that he did that. So I imagine it was the boldness that attracted him to it. This white guy's trying to go up against Jim Crow, like he's going to get shot by the end of the day. One day, Hudson witnessed Murphy give a very similar speech, this time in favor of the Scottsboro boys who were on trial for their lives. After witnessing the city viciously attack Murphy with harsh words and death threats by the KKK, Hudson followed Murphy to the local CPUSA meeting to see where he was getting his influences from. When he walked in, he described the scene of the meeting like a newsroom. Quote, dozens of people bustling back and forth, and they were all talking about the same thing. What could be done to further support for the Scottsboro boys? What they were saying ranged from, quote, how much money can we donate, to, quote, how many people can we dedicate to a march, to, quote, how many people need to be made aware of this case still. Hudson described in his autobiography that this scene was unlike he had anything ever experienced at an NAACP meeting, or any other organizational meeting for that matter. Very quickly, the CPUSA and the Trotskyist Communist League of America became the dominant outlet for expression and activism throughout Birmingham, outputting the membership of the NAACP 3-1 by the 1932 presidential election. And when Nell Irving Painter asks Hudson again, why do you think that's the case? He almost just verbatim restates his original excuse. It's because of the party's stances and the way that the NAACP presented themselves. They were unrealistic on their approach. Among the most visible vestiges of the party's activity in the South was done by an organization known as the International Labor Defense League, or the ILD. They appropriated funds and hired lawyers to represent communists, labor leaders, and minorities in significant cases, which include the Scottsboro case, numerous Smith Act trials, as well as the next case that I'm going to talk about. But the question that I have about the quick little bit on Angela Herndon is do you feel like Angela Herndon's experience reflects what Ford was trying to do with the party? In other words, is Angelo Herndon's testimony clarifying that Ford was right and Ford actually did have the pulse on African Americans better than the leadership did? Or do you think it's more circumstantial, that Hudson was just kind of caught up in the rift of socialist
You mean Hosea
movements?
Hudson, not Angela Herndon.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Hosea
Okay.
Hudson.
I knew
I'm
what
sorry.
you meant.
Yeah,
I'm
my
sorry.
bad.
I knew
My
what you
bad.
meant.
What do you guys think?
I think he was in the right time, in the right place at the right time.
Okay. So not necessarily a product of the party changing stances.
Excuse me.
He was drawn to the party because of their stances,
Okay.
and he had a similar stance.
Okay.
I think there's a general lesson of all this,
Mhm.
for all of us,
Mhm.
including me, and that is that there's a tendency for people in the party over the years not to listen. And it's, I don't know what the reason is, but I've seen it so many times. We don't pay attention. What is it that they're saying? What are they really talking about? And we're talking about, what did Trump say the other day? You know, you say that to some people and they, oh my God, you know, what do you mean, oh my God? We have to know what, I remember telling people recently that I listen to Rush Limbaugh all the time. And the reason why is because he gives the party line of the Republican Party. He tells you what they're gonna do. And it's almost, like he says this today, tomorrow morning, that's what they're doing. And he tells you a lot of things that you don't hear. And that's why they're so powerful, because we don't pay, because they do speak to a lot of people and they raise a lot of issues which are important besides their racism and everything else. But we have to learn how to pay attention to people. That's, I mean, I'm not picking on anybody, but I'm guilty of that too.
Right.
We don't listen.
We don't
Some-
respect them.
And well, whatever, I'm not talking about just black Americans and white Americans, I'm talking about generally speaking.
Right.
Especially workers. And the reason for that is obvious, and that is the class issue.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're educated, they're not. You know, what does this person know that's working out here cleaning the sewers? What the hell do they know? You know, I mean, you know, there's an attitude like that. It's reinforced by the kind of society we live in. But we have to learn how to pay attention. What are they really telling us? That's my point. Anyway, excuse me.
I fully agree. That was a good point. One thing that I would throw out there that really stuck to me after I first read Hosea Hudson's autobiography and absorbed everything I just covered is he pointed out, and he's like, I had not read a single bit of Marx or Lenin. I knew nothing about Marxist philosophy. I don't know anything about their methodology of organizing workers. I don't know anything about accomplishing this. But he was still attracted to the party. And I think, you know, these days you sometimes hear, especially among younger comrades, I'll hear on the internet, they'll be like, well, you won't understand it unless you read this book. Like, you're gonna need to read this source document. You're gonna need to, like, look at this strike or look at this. Like, using anecdotal points to be like, you don't understand communism or Marxism unless A, B, C, like, you jump these hoops. It's like, well, then how do you explain someone like Hosea Hudson? Are you going to tell me he was a bad communist because he joined the party without knowing anything about Marx or Lenin? I think that's nonsense.
Right.
So I think that's an important takeaway there, is that he was attracted because of the party's change in stances and what they were advocating, not the philosophy, not the methodology. And he looked at his options and said, that is obviously what I would want to support, regardless of how they came to that conclusion. I don't think Hosea Hudson cared how they came to the conclusion.
Right,
To him, it was the
actions-
right conclusion.
Actions
Well,
speak louder than words.
We're materialists, and the simple fact is, like, yeah, there's gonna be a lot of us that join the party because of our ideological and our intellectual pursuits and whatever, but most people are gonna identify with us because of the material circumstances of their lives, saying, hey, like, I want this material improvement and the party can help us get that.
Yeah.
So, like, we need to understand that, like, if we want the mass support we need to actually change things, we need to be going to the masses and saying, like, what materially do you need?
Or we look like people, we look like ordinary people. And ordinary people are seeking out something like them, like and that we speak about things and we act on things that other ordinary people, mostly working class people, identify with. We were just, in fact, at a Democratic Party meeting, and I looked around, and all I could think of is, the people in this room are my people. They look like me, very integrated group of people. They're all against Trump with a passion. And I thought, I really feel comfortable here.
And pro-labor.
You know, and pro-labor. And I asked Steve, how many people do you think are from the UAW? Because we were meeting in a UAW hall. But if you feel comfortable, and I'm not saying I'm going to the Democratic Party for my leadership, just to be clear, but if you're comfortable with the kind of people who are giving leadership and they are going the direction you feel is necessary, where else would you go? You might join another organization also, but that would be your political home.
Yeah, in fact, Hosea Hudson shared membership in both the CPUSA and the CLA. So, like, if we were to even, like, probably in the future we'll have a session where we go over the Trotskyist split, but
Yeah.
an important thing about that split is men like Hosea Hudson did not care one iota about that split. They were like, are we meeting today? Because if you guys aren't meeting today, then I'll go to the other meeting that is happening today. So that's an important component there, I think, as well. All right, so to go into a legal case, because part of the point I was making before was that these landmark legal cases kind of started the discussion of the civil rights movement. I do want to talk about a legal case that is not usually considered a landmark one, but I'm kind of going to argue that it is a little bit of a landmark early case for civil rights. And I'm not talking about the Scottsboro Boys, I'm talking about Angelo Herndon, which we've brought up in our courses a few times before, but I want to go over the significance of the trial and its proceedings more specifically here. So, Benjamin Davis, grew up in Dawson, Georgia, a city that was racially segregated along the rail tracks and was split the town by east and west sides. Davis grew up growing under the Jim Crow system, as well as living within, quote, what he described as, quote, the kind of peace that white supremacists say is disturbed when African Americans become restless for their rights. Davis joined the ILD, the International Labor Defense, after graduating from Harvard Law School, right around the time that the Scottsboro case was becoming national news in mid-1932. Within just a few months of working, Davis landed his first case representing Angelo Herndon from Atlanta. Angelo Herndon was charged with insurrection for organizing a joint black-white protest against the city's housing laws and its lack of fair representation in the state government. The charge, specifically labeled insurrection, was done on the basis of Angelo's organizing nearly 300 individuals in a matter of just 1 week, the majority of which were African Americans. So, I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie Malcolm X, that with Denzel Washington in it. There's a scene in it that reminds me of this where Malcolm X's friend was beaten up by police, taken into police custody, and Malcolm X demanded to go see him to make sure that he wasn't critically injured and didn't need to go to the hospital. And the police kept telling him no, you can't go back to see him, you can't go back to see him. And then Malcolm X calls in his squad of guys, and they all show up in leather jackets and suit coats outside. Some of them are armed with clubs, some of them have chains, and the police eventually say okay, yeah, you can come check on him. And he came back and he finds out, yeah, the guy needs to go to the hospital. And then he gets the hospital to send a representative and to determine that is in fact the case. And what does the chief of police say when Malcolm X orders the guys to leave the police station by just waving his finger? And this was a true thing.
Yeah.
The police chief said, no African American should have that much power.
That's right.
I think he actually said no N-word should have that much power. Well, think of the same thing here. Angelo Herndon organized nearly 300 individuals against the state's laws on segregation in just a week. So to the people of Atlanta and the people of Dawson were thinking, oh my gosh, this guy's got a lot of power. When he was arrested by private investigators that were hired by the local police, and they raided Angelo's hotel room as he was making a phone call outside of them. It was actually a motel. In it, they found CPUSA documents, copies of Lenin's work, specifically State and Revolution and What Is to Be Done, ones that we read. So don't be caught with the police with those documents. To be clear, insurrection in Atlanta at the time was a crime that carried the death penalty. And it forced Davis to approach the defense in a manner that was different from what could be normally expected. The first thing that a lawyer would probably tell you in a case like this is you need to argue for the constitutional rights of Angelo Herndon. You need to say that his constitutional rights were violated. Davis said, we can't do that. We can't do that. Davis did come into this novice, but he was one that understood the legal bias of the courts. He was from this area of the country. He wasn't from this particular city or state, but he was within the area and was used to the kind of injustice that you could find in the courts. Davis's first experience in the courtroom was when he was 16, and his father defended him for taking the wrong side of a bus to go to school. In that experience, the judge told Davis's father that he was ruining his son's future by planning to send him to an education in the North, where he would, quote, be taught the lies of equality and the immoral philosophy of equal justice. This is something a judge told him in a courtroom. So, in the Herndon case, Davis did not think he had the ability to defend Angelo's innocence. In fact, he considered it a dead issue when the prosecutor claimed that this case was against, quote, godless communism and Negro domination. Davis thus needed a different approach, one that the courts would not expect, but also one that could be defensible both rhetorically and with precedent. After just one day of examining his resources, Davis came up with a plan that was radical and poignant. Rather than argue that the citizenship rights held constitutionally by Herndon had been violated, which would then allow the prosecution to argue why the denial of such rights are justified, Davis instead argued that, quote, the jury system of Georgia in 1933 was illegal and unconstitutional and had operated for 20 years in accordance with a policy of premeditated and deliberate exclusion of qualified Negro citizens. In other words, Davis charged that the entire court and judicial system of the state of Georgia, not Herndon, were to blame for Herndon's situation. Presiding Judge Lee B. Wyatt dismissed Davis during his opening statement, to which Davis immediately responded that he desired to see this case elevated to the Supreme Court. Once he had to go to the appeals process to the outside the city and go to the state of Georgia, he took his concerns to Georgia State Governor Eugene Talmadge to see if he could kind of get any kind of protection before moving the case forward. Talmadge centered his concerns with this case on, quote, the meddling outsiders and northerners, and questioned Davis's education and his known membership in the CPUSA as a possible bias against the South. Davis explained that his support for the law and the Communist Party were, quote, not due to him knowing much about communism, and that in fact he knew very little about the philosophies of Marx and Lenin. What he did know, he told the governor, was, quote, that he would vote for any party that offers him and his people a square deal. Public opinion, now this might not have gone anywhere, had public opinion about the case not turned against the governor once Robert E. Burns published his book, I'm a Fugitive from a Georgia Chain Gang, which highlighted the biased nature of the judicial system in the South. And it really started the public discussion of why racial bias in the courts is a problem, as opposed to just a fact. The state of New Jersey, for example, went so far as to refuse to extradite a non-Georgian fugitive after reports of Georgia's mistreatment of prisoners, including Angelo Herndon in 1933, made national headlines. In the spring of 1934, Herndon's case was lifted to the Supreme Court of Appeals and handed off to another lawyer from the ILD. Davis remained in Georgia to build his case against the Georgia penal system. At the Supreme Court of Georgia, Davis requested additional representation from the ILD, and he added a woman named Carol King as a secondary legal representative. The two presented their case to the court in a 50-minute presentation about the history of Georgia law after the Civil War and its relevance to Herndon's case. Specifically, they brought up numerous transcripts and records of court proceedings, countless, like literally thousands, and showed how each time there was a jury present, there was never an African American on the jury. They never sent out jury duty calls to African Americans in the state. And he proved it back upwards of 25 years. He also had produced 2 versions of final transcripts. One which was the official archival record, and then one which was the record made available to the public, where he would point out that numerous words and phrases were omitted or replaced. Specifically, the N-word and various racist insults were replaced with darky or Negro. And in Davis's eyes, this act expunged the very substance of prejudice that he was attempting to prove the court guilty of. In other words, he's saying the court is not only guilty of prejudice, they are guilty of trying to cover up this prejudice. After his protest in court against these redactions of statements fell upon deaf ears, because the Georgia Supreme Court was like, we don't really care, and they upheld the verdict of Fulton County and declared the Georgia state penal system just and unbiased, Chief Justice Richard B. Russell delivered the verdict to Davis and then instructed him to, quote, never again refer contemptuously to the arguments of state attorneys and never become involved in such cases again. At the Supreme Court of the United States, the ILD strategist Whitney Seymour and Columbia law professor Walter Gellhorn successfully defended Herndon's innocence, and then Davis gave him a call up, asked him to come back to Georgia and file a writ of habeas corpus, which then led to the Georgia State District Judge Hugh M. Dorsey declaring the state's law on insurrection unconstitutional as it violated the First Amendment of free rights or free speech and assembly. The trial put Davis at the start of his career, but not in a very favorable position. He was successful, but being a successful African-American lawyer defending the rights of an African-American doesn't necessarily make you a popular lawyer in the law community. Prior to the case, Davis was met with what he described as, quote, the same benign cooperation given to all African-Americans in the court system. After the case, Davis said he was always met with suspicion and doubt in each legal setting he attended. For weeks after the case, Davis faced death threats from the local Ku Klux Klan, who at one point placed a revolver outside of his door with a single bullet requesting his suicide. As for civil rights, the Herndon trial mixed with the outcome of the Scottsboro case by 1938 to denote a significant rise in civil rights activism to a level unheard of during any period prior to the Brown decision. In Davis's words, the aftermath of the Herndon case demonstrated that, quote, what had become clear to the class-conscious Georgia officials had also become clear to large sections of African Americans in the street. The sentiment for addressing court bias and injustice of Jim Crow was, after 1938, no longer something that had to just be pushed by communists in the ILD. Now this idea of challenging it in the court system was being picked up by non-communists or more moderate socialists or even members of the Democratic Party. In other words, it had become a self-sustaining campaign by 1938. The lasting impact of the trial was how it used free speech to deem a law unconstitutional, a tactic which ultimately was the successful means to combating the Smith Act trials in the 1950s. Herndon's case was cited as precedent in the Michigan 6 trial of 1952, the Philadelphia Smith Act trial of 1953, and eventually won over the Supreme Court with its citing in the 1957 case Yates v. United States, which deemed the Smith Act unenforceable unless there was a clear and present danger. Herndon's case surfaced again in the aftermath of Selma, Alabama, where defense lawyers referred to the decision regarding assembly as the basis for defending the right of Martin Luther King to march. Angelo Herndon's brother Milton went on to die in the Spanish Civil War fighting fascists in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, if nobody knew that. So that's my wrap-up of the Angelo Herndon case and how Benjamin Davis kind of brought this to significance. I want to quickly kind of recap these things together, and then I have a couple of questions for you guys. To quickly recap what we've learned today, we talked about how 3 individuals from the 20s and 30s represented an early glimpse into what we call the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, and how this movement originated with grassroots efforts pushed by members of the Communist Party, members of the Socialist Party, and more specifically was pushed by a conscious effort to become more integrated with African American citizens. Ford's appeal about the uniqueness and the exceptional nature of racism in the United States necessitated the party's new stances on combating racism. Hudson, who was among those attracted to the party by these new stances, explained why such ideals were palatable to numerous African Americans in the South, particularly in that while sometimes idealistic, it did offer a solution that was more relatable to the black workers of the South than an organization like the NAACP. Finally, Davis's defense of Angelo Herndon, who was arguably on trial for being black just as much as he was on trial for being a communist, set a precedent for future legal battles regarding free speech, assembly, and assembling to end Jim Crow, in addition to having membership in the Communist Party. The most significant lasting impact of these experiences collectively was how they influenced and directed the subsequent civil rights movement. Most importantly, these battles were not always won because of the courts, the way that I started this off, the way that most history has taught us, that it begins with court decisions. Herndon's case proved that the state courts had to be appealed if justice was to be served. That if anything, you couldn't have the Brown v. Board decision unless you had cases like the Scottsboro Boys and the Angelo Herndon case first making the spearhead into the justice system. Ford's case proved that you did not require a major legal case making headlines to draw on the attention of marginalized Americans. You simply needed a message and a set of policies that they could identify with positively. Hudson's case proved that certain organizations, which became extremely important to the civil rights movement later on, the NAACP, failed to gain traction for the same reason that the CPUSA succeeded, their methods. By appealing to citizens in a manner that related to them as opposed to attempting to box people into societal expectations, the CPUSA saw a tremendous amount of support among African Americans in the early 1930s, to the point where communist parties around the world began to take note at the effectiveness of organizing a racially divided populace. In the mid-1930s, the CPUSA, the CLA, and the Socialist Party of America were the most racially diverse political organizations in the country, and the CPUSA was the first to place calls for an end to Jim Crow on presidential campaign slogans. The ILD, which is now known to have been predominantly funded by the party, was outspoken in its legal campaigns with regard to an emphasis on free speech and the rights of minorities. So, my question to you guys is, up until about a decade or so ago, why do you guys think we didn't hear this side of civil rights? Is it like a conspiracy that people are trying to like prevent people from knowing this side of the history, or did we just not know it, or people didn't speak up? Why do you guys think it's only within the last decade that people are starting to see the links between this kind of grassroots organizing and then the subsequent civil rights movement?
Well, I mean, kind of as you pointed out, in some cases, some of the ways that the party tried to push for it wasn't necessarily out in the open. I mean, obviously a lot of it was, but I think there is a concerted effort to try to rewrite history. You know, it's like how the Republican Party will point out that Lincoln was a Republican and, you know, the Ku Klux Klan was started by the Democrats. Like, it's technically true, but I mean, clearly that's not, you know, any kind of substantive type of claim. So yeah, I think there is, to some level, a rewriting of history, but I think it's more, I guess, ignorance. Like, just no one was out there explaining the history until recently.
I mean, we have like, for example, most of the documents that I had on Ford, they are documents that are from the 20s and 30s. They've been available this whole time.
Yeah. I guess I mean more like, most people are more familiar with, say, the struggle of the 50s and 60s, and those movements obviously built on the movements of the 20s and 30s that we just discussed, but the movements of the 50s and 60s didn't necessarily want to broadcast that they were built on these movements started by the Communist Party because of the kind of general consensus in the country that would have actually harmed them in their organizing.
Okay.
We started you ended in the 30s, and the whole anti-communist movement in this country and around the world was in the early 40s, and it wiped out history. If you look at textbooks from that period of time, they're different than what you get way after. You said 10 years or so
Yeah.
from now. You know, in the 20,000s, it's different than in 1943.
Mm-hmm.
And the academics were kept from speaking out. They were fired.
So
They
that's
were
the question.
eliminated from their jobs. Teachers were eliminated for their jobs, and textbooks were written by people maybe from Alabama or Texas.
So that is ultimately the question. If we want to narrow it down to like academia, do you think academia as a whole made a conscious choice to be like, we're not going to publish the links here because we don't support that idea? Or do you think they didn't want to publish it for fear out of persecution?
I think fear out of persecution. I'm sure there's racism involved, but and their own anti-communism. But that period was so fearful,
Yeah.
so fearful.
Laura, you gonna say something?
Well, I think my answer would be that how do people define history? And it's always been defined by the kings and queens and power of the presidents. I mean, when you're in high school, you get a litany of all the presidents and all the wars, and that's how we're taught
The
history.
history of great men.
Yeah, and until the 60s, they really weren't, or 70s maybe, they really weren't teaching about civil rights at all, let alone, of course, left-wing history. And now you're seeing a lot of change. That New York Times 1619 project about slavery is a good example of that, how historians or journalists are looking at history in a different way. They're trying to uplift the experience of black people in this country. So I think a lot of it's just the mindset of the people who write the history, and the notion that history is just about these very big events and nothing in between.
I think that an important way to maybe look further into that, and you made me think of it, is you might be able to go into like the records of law courses and see when do they start teaching the significance of the Angelo Herndon decision and the Scottsboro decision and then the Yates decision. Like, when do these start showing up as being taught in the classroom? Because you'd think that if the lawyers and the law schools didn't want that to become canon, they would just not teach that sort of stuff. You know what I mean? Were you gonna say something?
Yes, I think there's another issue that's sort of hinted at here in the discussion, and bringing it up to date. For example, this whole thing around Bernie running for president, and a lot of these people, it's like Jesus Christ came back, you know, and if he doesn't make it, the world ends. And the issue is the movement.
Yeah.
Franklin Roosevelt ran on a campaign of balancing the budget. Let's never forget that, 1932. He didn't come out with a New Deal until he got into office, and he saw what was happening, and he was smart enough to get some people together and so forth and so on. But it was the movement in the streets that was going on. The whole Depression, the struggles that you described around Jim Crow, etc. And that's what's missing in a lot of people's thinking. That's what, in my opinion, that's what defines a Marxist-Leninist, a communist. Because we understand, hopefully, that it's the movements that create history. Now, individuals play an important role in history, yes. Of course, Fidel Castro, Lenin, Marx, etc., Ho Chi Minh, but the main thing is the movement. If there's no movement, if there's no army, where are you going? You know what I mean? There is nothing. I think that's very important to keep that in mind. Excuse me.
Yeah, those individuals all were not leaders just in the sense that they were, these great people that everyone just automatically listened to. I mean, they were kind of just the focal point of these mass movements that already were there,
Yeah.
And I think it's very easy to ignore that, and it's really common, unfortunately, I think, in leftist circles to hope for this new person to lead the movement.
Yes.
To be waiting rather than saying, no, we need to build the mass movement, and the rest would follow.
It kind of reminds me of the anonymous theory of history in that, yeah, we give a lot of agency to people like Marx and Lenin because we know their name and we know that they did this. But does the fact that they did it mean that if they were to have not been born, that nobody would have done it?
Someone-
That suggests that the individual is more important than the movement, which is not true. As we've just gone over, it is the movement which creates those ideas in individuals. So, anonymous historical theory suggests if Karl Marx, the individual, was never born, somebody else would have eventually fulfilled his shoes and come to a similar conclusion because he was not influenced by God or imbued with divinity. He was influenced by people around him and the existing conditions that he lived in. So, to kind of wrap this up, I think if we were to ask ourselves the question of why we don't hear about this story more often, and why is the narrative of court-based solutions so dominant in our culture, we need to only look at what the media and education, that is academia, does to the word socialism. In the 1920s, anti-communist labels were a means to charging someone with sedition or support of foreign nationalism. In the 1930s and 40s, however, at least in the early 40s, it was more easily associated with attempts to promote, quote, black supremacy and the subjugation of the white Christian nuclear family. By the 1950s, this movement that we know of as civil rights had gone through a public purge conducted on behalf of the State Department, passed by FDR with the Smith Act, executed by Truman with loyalty oaths, and upheld by Eisenhower until the Yates decision ruled it ineffective. While most of those advocating an end to Jim Crow in 1932 were either communist or could be associated in some way with communists, most of those advocating an end to Jim Crow in the mid-1950s claimed to be apolitical. If you were to ask them, they would say, I don't have any open political ties. Anti-communism and the Second Red Scare thus served a purpose not previously examined by historians and is only beginning to have acute attention. These trials effectively killed not just the best organizers of the labor movement. That's what the dominant historical narrative of McCarthyism is. This killed the labor movement. Taft-Hartley, loyalty oaths, purging from the CIO, etc. However, these trials also killed the best organizers and legal teams who were fighting for civil rights in the 1930s. Because the word socialism was effective enough by 1948 to deem someone guilty of trying to overthrow the government, identifying as such and continuing to associate with openly socialist or communist organizers was actually detrimental to your goals of trying to promote civil rights. It was a scene that few today can likely fully understand. To make your case for civil rights using the language and ideals of socialism in the eyes of the post-World War II justice system was tantamount to arguing that equality under the law was socialism, and that justice for minorities was proletarian revolution. Civil rights activists thus had to work to disassociate themselves from such identities, lest they become subject to the same harsh treatment faced by the CPUSA and countless non-party socialists as well. This remained the case until 1957 when the Smith Act was deemed unenforceable. By then, however, most of the passionate activists had either fully left political organizing or were younger and sought newer organizations to challenge not only the courts, but also the left's, quote, old guard, and the notion that activists required the wisdom and experience of older organizers such as Ford, Herndon, and Davis. There were other factors that were involved in our growing understanding of why younger activists in the 50s and 60s turned away from the CPUSA and the Socialist Party. One major factor that was likely overlooked for years is that despite being popular among African Americans, only 20 people of color served on the party's national committee from 1930 to 1961, compared to over 155 whites. There's also a disparity between the backgrounds of whites and blacks who joined the party. Most of the highly active African American communists were highly educated. Ben Davis graduated from Harvard Law, William Patterson from the University of California, Berkeley, and Doki Wilkerson from the University of Michigan. Some historians believe this helps explain why many joined the CPUSA in the 1930s when there was little danger to doing so, and why many left the CPUSA and cut their ties when that danger became real. they were educated enough to realize we need to get out. Overall, American communists' fight against racism was one of the most principled battlegrounds that spanned across the various dimensions of communist organizational work. But by 1950, it was no longer effective to, even for CPUSA organizers to identify with civil rights campaigns, because they immediately then attached the idea that this civil rights campaign was promoting socialism. So, next time when we meet, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into more specific instances of combating racism, such as how the unemployment councils in the 1930s focused on defending African Americans from evictions in certain cities, and how the CPUSA combated attempts to race bait in key labor battles such as the Flint sit-down strike and the 1940 strike at the Rouge. And I'm also going to bring up some of the more recent historical stuff I've dug up on Beatrice Lumpkin's effort to fight racism in Chicago housing districts in the 1950s. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this little
Thank you.
Black History Month
Yeah,
session
yeah.
for the day.